Okay, yeah, right now I'm hearing you pretty good, loud and clear. So it says it's setting up the Facebook meeting for Facebook Live. Okay, looks like. Okay, we're live.
We're ready to party. Okay.
Yes. All right, good afternoon or evening, as the case may be. Welcome to our March virtual lecture with the Southeast Tennessee Resource Conservation and Development Council. My name is Seth Schaefer. I am the Executive Director for the Council. And joining me this evening is Leslie Honiker. She is the NRCS State Agronomist for the state of Tennessee. And today we are going to be talking about industrial hemp production. So if you have any questions, I will be monitoring the Facebook page for any comments that come in. And then at the end of the lecture, I will be sure to forward those on to Leslie, and we will answer your questions live if any come in. So Leslie, the time is yours. Take it away.
Okie doke. Hi, folks. My name is Leslie Honiker. I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I'm based in Nashville. I work for the smaller department known as the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I can just tell you right now, we are a great use of your tax dollars. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, I will convince you that that is the case. So today I'm going to talk about hemp production. Hemp came onto the agriculture scene, I guess you could say, was reborn onto the agriculture scene after the 2014 Farm Bill. And since then, there has been a lot of change in regulation and our understanding of the plant and how we grow it. So today I'm hoping to just provide you with kind of a cursory overview of how you can navigate the production of the plant in the most sustainable fashion. So I'm just going to give you an overview here. You know, there's going to be the obligatory statement about what hemp is versus marijuana, blah, blah, blah. I work for the government, so I should probably talk about that, right? We're going to talk about field preparation and pest management considerations and techniques, harvest and post-harvest handling, hemp products and marketing. Actually, we're not. I am literally the wrong dummy to ask about that. We're going to focus on the agronomy, so the production side of it today. That is a whole other conversation for another day entirely. And lastly, we're going to talk about environmental considerations along the way and conservation opportunities and how those might be accessible to you. So, industrial hemp is not your Uncle Larry's ditchweed. If you all know what that term means, I'm not judging you. Please don't judge me. So, what is the difference between hemp and weed? So I'm going to give you a couple choices here. One is psychoactive and the other isn't. They are the same species. One is more economically profitable, and one is illegal, and the other one is usually legal. So let's go through each of these. One is psychoactive and the other isn't. So really the thing that distinguishes hemp from marijuana is that marijuana is considered a plant that produces 0.3 THC or higher. Studies show that THC is one of the most psychoactive chemical constituents within the marijuana plant. But that a plant would have to have a content of at least 1%. However, for the sake of being compliant in the regulatory environment, hemp are any plants that are grown here that have less than 0.3 THC. So when we talk about something being psychoactive, that's also up for debate within the medical community, as well as the stoner community. there are chemical constituents within the plant that are said to have wellness properties, and we'll go over those here in just a second, just for a pure awareness standpoint and not so much to talk about whether one is good or not. So there is a debate again about whether or not these are the same species. So they're both considered cannabis sativa. So when we use the term cannabis, we can also be talking about hemp, not just weed. But what scientists have done is they have looked at the genetics of each of these plants. And although they are considered the same species, so to speak, genetically they're very different. And that comes from years and years of adaptation in the wild, as well as human intervention when it comes to breeding. One is more economically profitable. I think that one just goes without saying, and we can just leave it there. And lastly, one is illegal, technically, and one is usually legal. And the reason I put usually in there is, again, because sometimes when the plant is grown, it can produce THC levels, we're talking about hemp here, that might exceed that of the 0.3 regulatory cutoff. So what I mean by that is sometimes the genetics of that plant might be considered unstable and might send that plant's cannabinoid content too high in terms of THC. So again, a little bit of history in terms of how industrial hemp got back on the scene as a legal crop. In 2014, there was a farm bill. And farm bills, for those of you who aren't too into the politics behind agriculture, that largely affects what we eat, the price of what we eat, what we wear, if folks have access to food altogether. So the farm bill makes the world go round, if you ask me. Of course, I work for USDA, so I'm going to say that. But the important distinction between the last farm bill and the most current one from 2018 is that 2018 made growing hemp a lot more accessible instead of just for pure research purposes. So we've seen a big bust, boom and bust cycle in hemp production. And again, if it looks like a duck, it acts like a duck, it smells like a duck, is it a duck? And in this case, when it comes to hemp, it looks like, acts like, and smells like marijuana. However, it is not the same plant. So when you're growing hemp, there's two main production methods. There's cannabinoids and there's fiber. So fiber production, as the name implies, helps folks make a product that is used for ropes or paper or clothing. So really the production methods are apples and oranges. The main method that we're going to talk about today is cannabinoid production. So that's growing the plant for that desirable trait of, let's just say, let's keep the terminology common, the buds, whether that is smokable or used to make a tincture or a cream. So a person might ask, what is a cannabinoid? So the cannabinoid that we all know in our culture is THC. That is just one of many chemical constituents within the plant. The one that folks most often grow industrial hemp for is CBD. There are other ones such as CBN, THC delta 8, CBG, so on and so forth. But largely the market, the legal market, is dominated by CBD production. And here in Tennessee, we've seen it serve a lot of our growers well. So the purpose of this presentation today is for me to walk you through what hemp production could look like, whether you're doing it in your backyard, you're doing it on a big industrial farm, or you're doing it in a small greenhouse. But I'm really going to focus largely on outdoor culture because I think that's the most accessible for most people. And what we've seen is that more acres are grown outdoors rather than in the indoor setting. So site selection and site preparation are really some of the most important considerations when it comes to growing hemp. So here in the background, we have, for those of you who might be familiar with commodity agriculture, those are soybeans from the prior growing season. And the little green guys coming up, that is wheat. That is being grown for a cover crop. So for those who aren't familiar with what a cover crop is, that is a crop that is separate from, we'll call the cash crop. So your tomatoes, your corn, that sort of thing, that is grown typically in the off season to make sure that the soil is covered to mitigate erosion and to build soil health. We'll talk about soil health here in just a little bit. Hint, hint, soil health is really the key to having successful agriculture and successful hemp. So when we're talking about our site, we want to make sure that it has good drainage. We don't want the soil to get clogged with water. What happens is the roots aren't able to respire. So just like if your yard doesn't drain well, you get puddling and your grass tends to die. You also want to think about soil fertility when you're thinking about site preparation. So you want to make sure that you're providing a favorable growing environment for that crop. So ensuring that it has all the fertilizer needs, the nutrition that it needs, and that it's at the right pH. So when we're talking about pH, we're referring to how acidic or alkaline the soil is. And typically speaking, hemp likes soil to be around a pH of 6.8-ish is really ideal, research shows. We also want to think about lighting. So you don't want a shady area. You want something that is full sun. This plant needs sun. You want good airflow. And you want to think about the crops that were grown prior and maybe the residues that might be contained on them. So as of today, there are a limited amount of pesticides that are permitted for use on hemp. And so if the crop that was grown before has a large pesticide load on it, a lot of residue, so to speak, it could interfere with the quality of the crop that you're growing. And the other thing that we want to think about is the crops that were grown prior. So this largely affects diseases. So hemp shares a lot of the same diseases as a lot of plants, such as tobacco, such as tomatoes, and most plants in that family. And it also shares some other pests, such as rootworms, cutworms, European corn borer, that sort of thing. So you really want to try to make sure that you're setting this crop up for success. So here's a progression here. Here's that cover crop. Just a few months later, it looks a lot more flush. Again, the benefits of covers are that they provide erosion protection, weed suppression, which when it comes to growing hemp is a big deal, disease cycle interruption, and really we're talking about the power of diversity within the soil. So let's think of it this way. If you had a town, and your town had a bunch of doctors, but no policemen, then you might have traffic problems, right? But if your town has doctors and policemen and teachers and nurses and folks that take out your garbage, you have a more stable community. The same thing goes for soil. You want a diversity when it comes to the critters that are underground supporting the plants above, as well as the plant roots themselves. So here is a cover crop that has reached maturity. So here you can see that the seed head has formed here. But the reason I've written on the slide that it's all about perspective, just like Instagram photos, folks, it's all about camera angle, right? This is that same stand. Yes?
None of the photos are coming through. We're just
Oh,
talking.
okay, so none of the slides whatsoever?
No, I
Oh,
think you might need to share your screen. So down here at the bottom of the Zoom panel here, there should be a green button that says share screen.
okay.
There we go.
Aha, how about that? Okay. Woo.
Yep. Now
Lord
we're
mercy. Okay, folks, we're gonna start from the beginning. Just kidding. So thank you for doing that. I'm a millennial, folks, but I don't know how to use computers. So look at this. Look at this pretty slide. Look at this one, hemp production basics. Obligatory statement about hemp versus marijuana. We went through all these things and now all the humor is lost. I'm sadly sad, little bit sad. So we're gonna catch up. Give you just a second to see what you've been missing, what your tax dollars paid for. And in this photo here, we were talking about growing for fiber versus cannabinoids. And in the background here, we're talking about fiber production, tall, stringy plants. We talked about cannabinoids being those chemical constituents within the plant that are thought to have therapeutic benefits. And we were just talking about site selection here. We've got some baby wheat coming up. And we talked about the various considerations to ensure that you have a good site and that it's prepared properly. And here again, you can see that wheat cover crop that we were just talking about, and the various benefits of having cover crops. And it's all about perspective. Okay, back to business. So like I said, Instagram photos, okay? So I'm told if I hold the camera above my head, it makes my face look really skinny. But if I hold the camera below, I have like 17 chins, true story. So with this picture, it's all about perspective. So you're seeing a cover crop here that has reached maturity. It looks good, right? But here, to the untrained eye, you might be like, that's no big deal. But it's actually pretty sparse. And what this is telling us is that within a field, you have a lot of variability within your soils. And you might have a cover crop that is more successful in one part of the field versus the other. And the reason that I'm really focusing on this slide so much is that you want a really thick cover. Because you want to be able to have good weed suppression. I'm just going to go ahead and provide a little spoiler alert about our pest management section. The biggest reason that hemp crops fail that I've seen, and talking to literally thousands of producers, are weeds. So some folks choose to mow between the rows. Some folks use plastic mulches and this sort of thing. But really, the most sustainable approach is having a good cover crop. So this is another cover here. It's pretty sparse. So anytime you see some soil there, it's the little brown dirt, that is an opportunity for a weed seed to be like, oh, let me take up some space. That thin cover crop stand isn't going to provide much weed control or soil health. So by the end of the growing season, all that stuff is going to have decomposed completely. There will be very little evidence that there was ever a grass growing there. So what that means is that it's important that we have enough so that at the end of the growing season, it's still there. So if you're like me and you learn by failure, that's really the most effective means for me. You may have had a lot of cover crop failures. I say that as your state agronomist. So an alternative is intercropping. So what we have here, these little teeny tiny seedlings, that is buckwheat. And the nice thing about buckwheat is that it grows really fast, so it can outcompete weeds. And again, folks, this is just a cursory overview. I could literally talk about this slide for weeks. We could have lectures every single week. But this, I just want to really just show this to folks so they see that it's an option. So we've selected our site. We've hopefully grown a cover. We have good drainage. We've provided some fertility. We know that it has a good amount of sunlight available. So we want to turn that cover crop into gold. And what we do here, when I'm talking about gold, I'm literally talking about money, folks. One of the largest input costs to raising industrial hemp, whether you're talking about growing it in a 5-gallon bucket or growing it in your basement or on a 4,000-acre farm, is labor. And part of labor considerations are dealing with weeds. Oops. So we're going to prepare for planting. So typical seedling appearance. The majority of folks that grow hemp will get seedlings or clones. Some folks start from seeds. I recommend that newer growers use seedlings or clones. So clones are just little teeny tiny babies that have been clipped from a plant, and we've allowed them to grow roots. So if you look at this picture here, these plants don't look too happy. They're pretty pale. So typically, if a plant starts out in bad shape, it's going to have a harder time. But you would be pretty amazed at how they adjust. These little boogers want to grow. But if you see a couple, if you're looking at these little plants here towards the base of the plant, you see little kind of curled up brown and yellow leaves. That is totally typical. It's pretty inconsequential. But if these leaves at the top here, towards the apex of the plant, look like they're in bad shape, then you might have cause for concern. So if you're buying these from a commercial supplier and you're paying top dollar for them, then I think that you should expect a good product. And what I'm seeing here is that these were nutrient deficient and they were struggling for light. So they were tall and lanky and stringy and pale. So they're having a kind of a hard time. So the next thing we should talk about is clones versus seedlings. So again, seedlings are little babies grown from seeds, and clones are little babies who were cut off their mama. And some folks are anti-clone. They say that seedlings have more vigor and they're tougher. Some people say, well, clones are more predictable. So clones are exactly what the definition says. Every single one of them is going to be the same. They're going to look like their mom. They're going to act like their mom. So if you know the plant is healthy to begin with, and you know a lot about that genetic line, then you're in really good shape. The other thing that you might want to consider before you put your plant in the ground is whether or not you want an auto-flowering plant. So for those who are not plant physiologists or don't know much about plants in general, I'm going to give you a quick and dirty lesson. So auto-flowering plants are those plants that no matter how long they've been in the ground, they are going to flower X amount of days from the day that they germinated. And this can be advantageous. It makes your harvest really predictable. It can make it to where you might, plant one a week ahead of the other. That way you have a little bit of wiggle room when you go to harvest in case there's a big rain or you've got labor shortages or that sort of thing. However, auto-flowering can be an issue, and we'll talk about that here in a second. And lastly, when we're talking about genetics, We're going to talk about feminized seeds versus those that are not. So when a person grows hemp, they largely desire a female plant. The female plants are those that produce those beautiful buds that folks extract the various cannabinoids from. Male plants will pollinate those female plants and can greatly reduce the cannabinoid content. We want to keep that lady frustrated, so we don't want any boys around. If seed is non-feminized, then it typically will have anywhere from 50 to 70% males. And so that means if you plant them in the field, you got to go out there and you got to cull the males. And we'll talk about why you got to do that. But for all intents and purposes, we can all agree that boys suck. Cool. Moving on. Let's talk about when you would want to plant and when you wouldn't want to plant. So I do not recommend planting when your fields are sopping wet. You can cause all sorts of compaction issues. Your plants are going to hate you. Your shoes are going to hate you. And don't plant when it's 1,000,000 degrees outside, because these things are little and you want to make sure that they have a shot. You don't want them to shrivel up and die. And if you're paying anywhere from $1.50 to $4 per plant, I mean, that's throwing a lot of money down the toilet. And we're going to talk about here in a second, we're going to talk about planting methods and then transplant shock. So back to the genetics, the auto flowering thing. So this little plant here was from a relatively newly bred line. And unfortunately, some of those, a very small percentage of them, started auto flowering. So once a plant starts flowering, so it's gone from a vegetative state into a reproductive state, it's just like me. I am a little person, and once I went through puberty, I didn't grow very much. So same with these plants. You want these plants to be big, you want them to put a lot of mass on them. And if you're being paid by the weight and cannabinoid content per weight, this is not good. Again, just make sure you have stable genetics. So those genetic lines that have been tested and they're tried and true. So we're talking about planting. I know we've spent like 20 minutes on like before planting, but now we're getting into the fun part. So considerations for planting. You want to make sure that whatever you're doing is scale appropriate. So it is appropriate given the amount of time that you have and the amount of labor that you have and literally the space that you're growing in. So this little contraption here, we call this our Frankensetter because we took an old tobacco setter and we modified it to make it no-till. And for a lot of you, that sounded like a bunch of Martian. But really what I'm trying to get at here is we needed to make something work for our scale. And so this is what we came up with. And when I said no-till, what I meant by there is that when we go to plant our plants, we're not going to till up the soil and disturb it. We want to keep the soil as intact as possible. And we'll talk about that here in a second. And then another consideration when you're planting, just the soil conditions and the residue. So when we're talking about residue, we're talking about what's left on top of the soil. So in the photo here, you see that cover crop has been crimped down to the ground so that it forms a mat. So you want to make sure that when you're planting, you can cut through that mat. Now I hate to say this, but I've been on hundreds of hemp operations, and folks, usually newer growers or growers that are trying to scale up but didn't necessarily make it through, they will say, oh, it's fine, I'm just going to plant an acre. I can handle an acre. So this operation right here that's pictured was about 5 acres. It was overseen by 3 very experienced agronomists with lots of free labor, and I regretted every minute of not having a better setter. It took us about 4-ish days once we got into our groove to plant 5 acres. It's a lot of labor, folks. So you want to make sure that you have the equipment that you need. So this is a big operation, and this is one of their setters. This is called a setter. So when folks are planting veggies and that sort of thing, they often use what's called a setter. And what that does is it takes little baby plants that have already been germinated, and it puts them to the ground. So when we were talking about considerations for residue, this is a cover crop that had not died yet, hadn't been terminated, hadn't been roller crimped down, or in conventional agriculture hadn't received a pesticide to make it senesce. Senescence is another word for dying. It just sounds a lot more sophisticated. So when we're looking at this machine here, it's like, ooh, look at this lovely cover crop stand, but it is not meant to be planted green. In this case, the equipment here, that's a little chisel coulter there, it did not like cutting through it. And then those press wheels, those are the little guys on the right, they did not like closing the furrow. It was not a fun experience. It required a lot of experimentation. This was a very frustrating experience for me personally. So there's me. I look really happy there for sure. But this is after we had crimped down some of that cover. And the way that we accomplished that was by literally dragging a railroad tie, and then it flattened the stems. So once this stuff had kind of gotten a little crispy, this machine was much happier. So the part in the prior slide, this right here, baboon, this is right behind, this is hard to see, but it is behind those press wheels right there. That is what is ensuring that we're making a little slit for the little seedling to go in. So while we're here, as you can see, this is called a 3-row setter. I think I forgot the name of the company, but they call it the Trium. On here, you can see that these things are spaced. They're about 5 feet apart. When it comes to planting hemp out in a field setting, a 4x5 spacing or a 4x6 is my preference, is really good to ensure that you have good airflow. So that means 6 feet on each side this way and 4 feet on each side that way, or vice versa, just somewhere around there, depending on the variety that you're growing. People can argue for days and days about spacing, but if you talk to the manufacturer of the seed, or you know somebody that has grown that particular cultivar, it's another word for variety, then you can get an idea of your spacing. Another consideration for spacing is the time of year. So if you're like me and you like to push it to the limit, and you want to try really early plantings and you want to try little really late plantings, you might go for smaller spacing. And the reason that we do that, especially in the late plantings, is because these plants are going to get very big because they require sunlight and days get shorter. So they're going to not be as robust of a plant. So I'm going to take a little drink here. This is brought to you by Off-Brand LaCroix. LaCroix is what makes the world go round, people. Okay, so that last setter, babao, that we just saw, this is what it does when it plants. So here's a consideration for folks who want to ensure that their plants are babied. This is called drip tape. So what drip tape is, it's a very efficient way to get water to your plant. It ensures that she always has sufficient water. She's never having to struggle for it. You can also supply fertilizer. It's called fertigation through these lines. It's very, very nifty. I will say this, if you are trying to grow large scale and you have never used drip tape, don't grow large scale, just don't. It can, it's a labor of love. So start small. Once you get these guys set up and calibrated, drip tape is your friend. You can get as fancy as you want with it. You can have different measuring tools that tell you, your soil's gotten to this moisture content. You can have it on a watering schedule. There are people who literally dedicate their careers to this stuff. They're like the engineers of the agronomy world. They tend to be weird, but they're great. I'm not one of those people. Okay, so soil moisture and temperature. So if you don't have that equipment that was just pictured, or you're just not sure when you should plant, the nice thing about having a cover is it's kind of like an insurance policy if you don't have irrigation. And even if you do, it's just extra coverage. What that cover does is it regulates soil temperature. So let's talk about, think about when you go to the beach. When you go to the beach and it's really, really hot outside and you have to run across the sand, it can be miserable, right? So think of your field as the same thing. If you don't have something to cover your feet or to cover the surface of that soil, it gets really, really hot. So do you think these little teeny tiny baby plants are gonna like it? No. But if you have a cover, it insulates, right? It's like the most environmentally friendly insulation you can get. And it regulates moisture and temperature so that you don't have to irrigate as much, and so your plants aren't stressed. It also helps too with soil organisms, but again, I spent years in graduate school studying just a couple of those organisms, so for all intents and purposes, your soil critters like it, and you should too. So again, economies of scale. This is our Frankensetter. This is our lovely little farmhand. Her name is Charlesy, and she decided that she would never grow hemp after this growing season. She was 18. It was great. He's like, oh, you're going to love it. No. This is what it looks like after we planted. So this is a little baby. It was literally 96 degrees that day. So do as I said, not as I do. But because we had really good cover and because the soil was in really good shape because it hasn't been tilled literally for 16 years, the plant was pretty happy. So here is your interruption to your regularly scheduled programming to talk about soil erosion. So when folks work up that soil a lot and we don't have cover, this is what happens. So this happened. This isn't years of erosion, people. This is like less than a growing season. There was no cover on the soil. And so this is what happened. So not only if we don't have cover and we till up the soil a whole bunch, is it hot and dry or whatever not so great conditions for our plants, the soil itself ends up somewhere else. There was a study that said, and this was in 2006, which seems like it should be yesterday, but it really wasn't. Soil erosion cost the American people $36 billion in 2006. So, inflation, math, wizardry, probably a lot more these days, right? Okay, back to your regularly scheduled programming. So this is a couple weeks, maybe a week and a half after planting. These are two different operations. The one on the left is the one that did not have irrigation drip tape, and the one on the right is the one that didn't have a great cover, but they have drip tape. That first week that those plants in the ground, it's kind of like being a newborn parent. I've never been a mom, but I saw my mom be a mom to my youngest sibling, and you're like, oh my gosh, are they breathing? Okay, they're okay. Same thing goes with these plants. You're like, oh, are they gonna die? And in my case, I just didn't plan it very well. And it was really, really hot. And it was really dry. And I was super worried. But boom, a week later, this guy is okay. Now, again, it's good to mitigate your risk where you can. So plan ahead. So by this point, we have reached the 4th of July. That's when this picture was taken. Those little babies had gone in the ground the 2nd week of June and the 3rd week of June. So the term growing like a weed is literal, folks. So we found out in this growing season that we would enter a drought, not like the 2016 drought. Oof, Lord save us. But what happened is we entered a drought, and we were really happy that we had this cover crop because our plants were okay. But I didn't think we were going to need to irrigate, and we ended up irrigating about 4 times. So when it comes to farming in general, but especially when you're growing industrial hemp, you have to adapt, people, and you have to have plan B. If you fail to plan to fail, is what one of my mentors tells me. And the point of this slide as well is to show you arguably one of the cutest dogs ever. His name is Foggy. And for scale, he is a 70-pound dog. That plant is really taken off. All right, 2 weeks later, 2.5 weeks later, wow. So you can see here, if you look in, there's this big bare spot in the middle. That is so that we could drive equipment through the field, / just keep count. It's really good to, I recommend labeling your rows, especially if you have different varieties or you're trying different fertility regimes, that sort of thing. If you look in the middle, you see some grasses, some weeds. So I really like this slide because it tells a lot of different pictures. Number one, it shows you where the canopy hasn't formed with these plants. You might get weeds that come up, right? So in the middle, those are the weeds that you're dealing with. But if you have a canopy that closes up, you're good to go. So something to keep in mind when you're thinking about spacing and timing and mulching. Another thing to keep in mind here too is like, wow, these plants grew really, really fast. And they were grown on slightly sloping land. You can kind of see here from the picture there. And when you have land that has a slope like that, it's more prone to erosion. Erosion is bad. So this was taken, I think, a couple days later. So this is just to show you how big those plants are. I'm 5'2" on a good day, and that's me. And these plants are not little. A lot of folks get overwhelmed. They're like, oh my gosh, this plant is huge. It's going to get top heavy. It's going to fall over. That can happen, especially if you over fertilize. But the point of this slide is to really show you that when it gets to this point in the growing season, especially for novice growers, this is when you can really start to see how plants differ from one another. How you can have a plant that is the same, we'll say genotype, so you have the same genes. So, you know, my brothers and I are the same genotype, but we're different phenotype. pH, pheno, meaning that we look different. So even though we have pretty similar genetics and we came even from the same mama, we look different. So these plants, if you really, really, really look close, they're slightly different, right? But they're similar enough. And these are the same, it's the same cultivar of plants. There's nothing wrong with either of these plants. They were treated the same, they were planted on the same day, all the same fertility. But phenotype can vary in a lot of different ways. And for some people, when it comes to growing these plants, phenotype is important because it largely tells you the growth habit of the plant. So you might want something that's more tall and upright. You might want something that's more bushy. That's a conversation for another day. But it can affect things like airflow and how sturdy the plant is, etc. So you made it this far in the growing season. And if you're like me, you're really psyched about these plants. It was your best growing season yet. And then you had a pest problem. And you're like, what sort of pest makes a plant look like this in a matter of literally seconds? And that's people pests. Besides weeds, people pests are the worst. So that's when we were looking at that slide about site selection, having something that is off the road, something a little more private, or if you're growing at home, having a privacy fence, that sort of thing is really, really important. And it was such a shame. This poor guy didn't know any better. The plant is relatively immature, so joke's on you, buddy. But here's the thing to think about when it comes to hemp. It wants to grow. It's a pretty hardy plant, but it can get any disease pretty much. It attracts all the pests, and there are pests from day one. So I would encourage you to get to know what some of those pests are. We're going to kind of touch on a couple of those. Now, when it comes to pest management, there's several different approaches, but kind of your last chance approach is using pesticides. There are some that are approved for use on hemp. I think there's maybe up to 11 now. I'm not going to go into those too much, but just know that you can't use whatever you want on these plants. It is literally, it's against federal regulations, so don't do it. And most of the time, if you're selling your even if it's the bud, or you're taking your plant to a processor to have it extracted into oils, they will test for pesticide residues. So just don't do it. When it comes to pest management, timing considerations. So if you're going to spray something that you're allowed to spray, it'll say on the label, don't spray within so many days of harvest. And when you're thinking about pests, like, when are you looking for pests? I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that in the middle of the day on your lunch break is probably not the time to look for pests. They're like us. They like the mornings and the evenings when it comes to this summer. So that's when you should really start looking for pests. And if you go out in your field and you're like, oh, what's wrong with my plant? Or you're like my mom and you call me and she's like, Leslie, there's this spot on my plant. I'm like, describe it. She's like, it's round. I'm like, okay, what does that even mean? Like, does it have a certain color? Tissue testing is great. Because even folks who are experienced when it comes to plant pathology or the study of plant disease, I can look at a plant and be like, oh, that's probably one of three things. And usually I'm right, but not always. And if I'm wrong, that can have huge implications. So tissue testing is important. So there are tons of labs out there that will do tissue testing for you. But usually if you go through the land grant, so that's for us down here to be the University of Tennessee, or you could hop over to Georgia or University of Kentucky, they tend to be a little cheaper when it comes to running those tests. And again, weeds. If you take the S off that word, it makes it sound illegal, right? Weeds, again, #1 hemp crop failure, time and time again. Experienced growers, inexperienced growers alike. All right, so we're getting towards the latter half here. So if anybody has any questions, I can take a little pause and answer those now. Okay, cool. If you didn't type fast enough, you're just gonna have to wait. Okay, so let's get back into typical pests in Tennessee. I know this is a lot of information, but I'm just gonna burst your bubble and say I could spend all day talking about this. And I know it's a lot to digest, but you're in luck. I work for free. Well, I mean, if you didn't pay your taxes, I don't work for free. I work for free. Like, tax evasion is illegal, but your taxes pay for my job. So there are resources out there for you. There are people who will help you through this for free, whether you're working with extension agents or you're working with NRCS. There's a lot of focus groups and growers groups and initiatives out there too. So, and there's a lot of information out there that's legit. So, typical pests in Tennessee. Lepidoptera. You're like, what does that even mean? Caterpillars. Caterpillars are probably, in terms of outdoor growing, the worst insect problem. They're terrible. They not only do they chew, they're leaf chewers, they can begin the disease cycle for things like bud rot, gray mold, botrytis is what that's called. And that is, I mean, your product is done if you get bud rot, pretty much. Other pests, grasshoppers, aphids, stink bugs, mites. Mites are the worst besides caterpillars. The thing about mites is they have really, really fast, they have rapid growth and reproductive cycles. So that means they evolve. So when it comes to mites, you have to have like a whole arsenal of things to deal with them, because they'll just laugh at you. They're like, huh, that's hilarious, you use this. And yeah, again, people are pests. And let's talk about pathogens. So bud rot, botrytis, gray mold, that's a pathogen. There are different types of pathogens, just like there are with people. There's fungal, there's bacterial, things such as bud rot, southern blight, leaf spots, root rot. I've seen entire fields get all of these things, and most of them don't do well. Your leaf spots, typically not a big deal. Soil-borne pathogens. So most of the pathogens that you are going to experience with these plants are those that actually come from soil. When I was talking about soil health earlier, the more balanced your soil is and the coverage that you have your soil, the coverage from the soil itself, from the plant, the more protection you're providing for your plants. So most diseases enter a plant either through injury or the root, or from soil splash. So the rain comes down and it splashes the soil and it splashes up onto your plant. It's not fun and it's hard to manage, but we can do it. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second. So how we do it? PAMS, not your mama's cooking spray for her muffin tin. PAMS is a way to make pest management less sticky. And PAM stands for prevention, avoidance, monitoring, and suppression. So prevention, here's an example. You go from field A to field B. On field A, you saw that you have blight on some plants. So when blight gets a plant, it's like day one, it's like, oh, I'm great. And like 2 seconds later, it's just totally, it's done. So you cut that plant down, right? So you go over to field B and you take your pruners with you, and you're just taking a couple of samples off plants. If you have tracked that disease from one field to another, so that's a preventative technique. Another thing is planting certain varieties or cultivars that do better where you live. So in the Southeast, we are a petri dish. I'm not sure if you knew that when it comes to growing things. And so picking varieties that are upright and have more of an open plant structure means that there's less of an environment for fungus and nasty things to really hang out. Avoidance. Again, another thing that we can do is avoid planting in wet, nasty, poorly draining soils. Monitoring. Monitoring is making sure that you keep an eye on what's trying to eat your plants, and you keep an eye on what's growing around your plants. And we do so to come up with what's called an economic threshold. So what that means is it's the time when if you don't deal with that pest, you're probably going to lose your crop altogether. And so it's best to figure out what that threshold is before it finds you first. So that's why prevention and avoidance are really, really good things. And suppression, that's like our last thing that we can do. Our pest has gotten there. We've tried all these, ways to try to get rid of it, and we can't, and it's taking over our plant. So we use a pesticide or some other means to ensure that the disease or the weed or the bug doesn't take over. So if you look at this slide here, the reason I have a picture of a moth is because if you monitor and if you learn about the different pests that you're trying to look for, you can often predict when they're going to become an issue. And the way that we do that with the black cutworm moth, it's a generalist. It eats everything. It eats wheat, it eats weeds, it eats all the things. We know that if the temperature has reached X amount of degrees for so many days, we know that soon thereafter, that guy's going to start laying eggs. And it's just a predictive thing that we can do to make sure we know what to look for. So when it comes to disease, you have to have three things. You have to have host and pathogen. All those things are, you have a high chance for disease. So as growers, what we can do is we can manipulate some of these things. And the one that we have the most control over is the environment. So if we create an environment that is not conducive to the growth of disease, then our plants are largely in good shape. So here's some picture of some pests. These little tiny guys are aphids. There are, I think, 4 main aphid types that I've seen on hemp plants. But again, you have pests from day one. If you are getting your plants from a supplier and they're covered in aphids, you have every right to be super mad. When you get your plants, take a look at them. Look under the leaves. Look on the stems. Aphids are not too worrisome from what I can tell with hemp production, but you still should get rid of them. And back to scouting. Boys are the worst. I think we agreed. They literally ruin everything. The economic threshold for a boy in hemp is 1. So if you look at these plants, to the inexperienced eye, you're just like, oh, look at that. There's just a hemp plant. But if you look really close, especially on that right photo by that person's thumb, those, my friends, those are pollen sacs. Think of pollen sacs like glitter for crafts. Despite all of your effort, glitter gets everywhere. So if one of these things gets mature enough to where it forms a pollen sac and it can release that pollen, it can pollinate every crop in your field and your neighbor's field and miles away. So it's important to scout even your feminized seed, and I've even seen clones turn into hermaphrodites. It's important to keep an eye on your crop. So this is a guy is spraying a fungicide, and the reason that he has to do that is if you look further up in the picture, he's using overhead irrigation. Remember us talking about soil splash earlier? It's not a good idea. There you go. Boom. So by this point, you made it this far in the growing season. You're like, I will never grow hemp again. I don't blame you. Let's discuss harvesting. And when we think about that, again, we have to go back to that concept of economies of scale. you have to ensure that you have the right tools and labor and time and inputs to make sure that it makes sense for you. For most people, I think a study from UT a couple of years ago said that the largest input cost for industrial hemp in Tennessee was labor. I think it's still the same. I can tell you that right now. And I think at a minimum, it's 30%. So, I mean, the plants are expensive, the time that you put in is expensive, the people that you hire are expensive. And this is not to discourage you. This is just to make you aware so that you can make proper decisions. So at this scale, this is actually a guy named Cam. He actually works for NRCS. He is using a weed eater with a blade on the end of it because that was appropriate for their scale. These plants got a lot bigger than we thought they would. We thought we were going to run over them with a combine and it was going to be easy. Bob's your uncle. No. Miserable failure. So, loppers, sawzalls, whatever it takes to harvest these guys. We're using tobacco wagons. So for those of us who grew up on tobacco farms, yes, this is worse. I've seen folks out there with pruners and shears. I've seen folks use combines. I've seen folks use chainsaws. I mean, reciprocating saws. It comes down to economies of scale and having the right amount of people on your team to help you. And once you harvest it, it can't just sit there. It's got to hang. It's got to dry out or it's going to get rotten. So again, this is what the field looked like. This is that same field that had that beautiful cover crop. And if you see here, I mean, like, look, there's some weeds coming up, but that cover is gone. This is what it looks like after all is said and done. And a very, very tired man named Brian there. So post-harvest field conditions and product handling. So you got to think about, like, you can't just leave your field looking nasty. Or in my case, I was like, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. You want to think about a cover, putting a cover crop in, and probably not planting hemp there the next year. You want to rotate those crops out. And we have to think about, once we harvest that crop, how are we going to handle it? How are we going to make sure that it gets to a form that is appropriate? So post-harvest handling, this guy is not one of those guys that ended up on a tobacco wagon. This was harvested separately so that a person could use this to sell those buds as smokable buds. It looks like buds, folks. It looks exactly what you think it looks like. So this needs to be treated with a little bit more care. So the rest of it was hung. People use big old tobacco barns. People use their basements. The biggest thing is you want to make sure you have airflow. You want to check to make sure that none of your buds have bud rot, because bud rot is one of those things that feeds on plants even when they're dead. And it can disintegrate the plant. So you want to make sure you don't mix that stuff in there. You want to think about your final product. If you're doing something that's more like for boutique sort of production, fancy, glass case sort of shop selling your bud, this is probably not how you want to treat it. But if it's going to be extracted, made into an oil, etc., this is probably a-okay. So really, if you're working with a processor, or if you don't have a relationship with a processor, a good rule of thumb is good airflow, get it down to 10% or less moisture, and get it into some sort of stable form so that you can store it. And try not, if you can, to let this stuff see the light of the day. Sunshine is shown to break down cannabinoids. So this stuff is sold on a per weight basis, concentration of cannabinoids. You want to keep it up as high as you can. Typically speaking, you're going to get some cannabinoid loss regardless. That's just what happens. But from handling and just time, it just breaks down eventually. It's just like any other plant material, it breaks down. So think about that. These are this is a moisture meter. You can get this at Home Depot or Lowe's or your local hardware store. Elder's Ace, my personal favorite. And this is one of the little buds that was harvested by hand. So it's handled differently. Here is where folks had the right two pictures, run it through a combine to try to strip it from the stalks. So this stuff, takes a lot of time to process. On the left, it was placed through a feed grinder. Now, some processors are okay with it, but as you can see there's a lot of stems and fibrous material, and they typically don't like it. So just make sure before you even put a plant in the ground that you have a plan for stripping and bucking. This is the process. That's what it's called, a plant. So I'm going to close up with two things. Number one, how you can get help to grow this stuff. And then number two, kind of like my top 10 things to keep in mind. So USDA, that's who I work for. That's the U.S. Department of Agriculture. These folks are here to help you, whether you're growing in your backyard or you're a person who has 4,000 acres of corn in Iowa. No farm is excluded. We can help folks figure out pest management, nutrient management, seasonal high tunnels, so those hoop houses, a lot of folks grow in those. If you're a conventional operation and you want to become organic, we can write plans to help you do that. We can help you achieve soil health, pay for cover crop seed and crop rotation. There's a lot of cost share assistance out there. I think last year alone, through just one of our programs in the state of Tennessee, I think we spent over $26 million for conservation programming to help people out. I mean, that's money in their pocket to make their farms more sustainable. The more conservation oriented your farm is, typically the more return you get on your investment, and the more return that your grandkids and their kids and their kids get on their investment. So if you're interested in USDA help via NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, there is an office in literally every single county in Tennessee. And if we have some folks tuning in from Georgia and Alabama, there's typically a service center in every county there too. And just tell them that you're interested in some of these things. So to close out, here are my top 10 tips for new growers. This is in no particular order. Number one, learn about the plant. Learn what all the terms are. Apical bud, bracts, all the technical terms. It will help you. If you form that vocabulary, it'll help you understand the literature that's out there. And when you're asking technical folks about it, they will be able to better help get you the answers that you need. Number two, site selection is key, whether you're indoors or out. We talked about that earlier. Number three, before you buy any genetics, verify that the person who is supplying that to you is experienced. There are tons of folks out there who have kick butt websites that look really pretty who don't know anything about the plant. Number four, test the plant throughout the growing season for cannabinoid content. You want to make sure that you keep that THC low and those other cannabinoids high. Number five, if you think you're going to do something and you've attached some sort of expectation of time, multiply it by at least 3. Even experienced growers know this. Number six, before you even buy anything or think about where you might plant it, give yourself a year, an entire growing season before you farm hemp, to get your fields ready, to build up your fertility, to set aside the time that you're going to need, because it takes a lot of time, and to ask all your friends for favors. Start small. I've seen so many people scale up way too fast. It's a lot of work, folks. Number 8, healthy soils, healthy plants. NRCS can help you get there. There's a lot of literature out there. Number 9, crop scout often. You want to look for the boy crops. You want to look at abiotic and biotic stressors. So does that plant look thirsty? Does that plant have a disease? Are there bugs, that sort of thing, and pest management. Number 10, have a plan in place and have a backup plan. Learn what the pests look like. Colorado State University has a really, really good picture book with typical plant pests for hemp. And University of Tennessee is coming out with some good stuff. The University of Kentucky has a pretty comprehensive pest pathogen guide out there. Those folks have really been doing some good research. And number 10 plus, there are a lot of salesmen out there. Don't drink their Kool-Aid. Make sure, it's hard to know if they know what they're talking about. So, ask around, get to know some more experienced growers, see if they can mentor you. And if they're selling you something and it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. There are free resources out there. There are people that can help you. Just educate yourselves. And that is it. Thanks, everybody. I think that's the most I've talked to people since I've been cooped up for a long time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leslie. I know I learned a lot. I've never grown hemp before. So it was a very informative lecture for me, just learning about this product and how to grow it. So thank you so much for your time and all the information that you provided this evening.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
I have been monitoring the Facebook pages that we've posted this presentation to, and it does not appear that there are any questions that have come in. People are commenting that they're enjoying the presentation and they're liking it, but no questions. So I think that means that you did an awesome job explaining yourself and explaining.
You know everything.
There you go. So for anybody out there who maybe they have a question, but they haven't posted it or whatnot, feel free to post it even after we end the live session. And I will be sure to forward your questions on to Leslie and she'll get an answer out to you. So,
yep.
One last thing I wanted to say before we end off the evening. We are going to be having our next lecture is going to be on April 6th. It's going to be at 12 p.m. Because we're going to be going live with Tammy Swihart. She's the NRCS State Grazing Lands Specialist. And so we're going to be going live on a farm, and the topic is going to be pasture management and soil health. So if you have any type of livestock and you're wanting to do better by your pastures and by them, definitely tune in with us. It's going to be a blast. So thank you for joining us, and I'll catch you next month.
Thanks.